Hi, my name is Robin Schwartzbird. I'm filming my very first YouTube video. I'm really excited about it. So I have here a Jane Davenport art journal. The paper is really beautiful. I've got a couple of pages here, not quite finished. And I decided for my first video it'd be good to paint the cover. So I was just using Jane's acrylics, just a few colors. So you only really need a couple supplies to do this project. It's very simple. I have a lot of really exciting videos to share with you, all kinds of arts and crafts and mixed media. You can find me here, Robin's Arts and Crafts, and I'm also online, robinsnestartschool.com, where you can find my art school. And I'm really excited. I have a lot to share with you. I'm putting a coat of gesso on the cover of Jane's journal, so you could do this on a canvas board as well. And you really want to gesso it because it seals it like a primer and you won't use as much paint. There's also the way the paint moves over it more fluidly, so it just makes it easier to paint as well. So it's really a good idea to cover it in gesso. If you don't have gesso, you could just use any cheap acrylic paint to put your first layer down as well. I put a quick streaky coat of Jane's acrylic turquoise paint on this, and I purposely left it a little streaky just to give it some texture. Here I'm using Jane's paint over pen, and it is in the color Starfish. And I'm just making a quick oval shape and dividing the shape in half. You can see I put the halfway mark a little bit higher than it was supposed to be, so I fixed that later by adding more hair on top of her head. And you want to make the eye the same distance apart as the width of the eye. What I like to do is kind of mock draw it first so that I end up getting it placed in the right place without making lines that I end up having to erase. It ends up being just a little bit wonky because you can't really erase paint over pen. So halfway between this middle line the eyes are on and the bottom of the chin is where you place the nose. And then halfway again between the nose and the bottom of the chin is where you place the mouth. I usually like to draw a little smile. And then for people who are new to drawing, it's easier if you make these little circle shapes so that you end up getting the face symmetrical. And symmetry just means that it is the same on both sides. So here I'm just dropping her little irises in. They're not totally even, but you can fix that later. That's a good part about painting with acrylic. And these little lines just represent her little nostrils and this line going up into her eyebrows. About 3/4 of the way from the inside of the eye to the outside edge is where you put the top of the arch. And this side is a little more dramatized so that you can see what that looks like, but I'll soften that up later. Then I'm just adding the little sides of her nose here and attaching the shapes to create her little mouth shape. So she has a little mouth. And there you have a little whimsical face, giving her a little curved neck and her shoulders. So here's the part of her hair, and that will be where her ears go. And you can see now how I'm adding a little more volume on top to correct the fact that I made the eyes a little high on her face. So you can hide a lot later. And just finishing up her little face. So here I'm starting to create some little flowers, and they're made up flowers. I was kind of wanting them to look a little bit like peacock feathers. So they don't look exactly like a peacock feather. It's more of a made up flower because we get to do whatever we want in our paintings. Why not? it's always a good idea to have shapes of 3s and 5s repeated rather than 2s to give your design just a little bit of a more aesthetic appeal. That's kind of what your eyes like to see. So you can see down here I'm going to add a 3rd shape in, even though it's partially covered up by her head. It'll still repeat the pattern. So because I made this part all streaky, there are some areas which are going to look a little bit lighter under the paint layer. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is paint some of the blue in these areas here around the eye where the shadows will be darker. But this area up the center of the face, as well as here and here, will end up being lighter. So this is that same color turquoise. And I'm just going to drop that into those areas. It's not going to be super obvious, but you can see the layers underneath, even if they're subtle, and it really makes a difference and it adds depth to your paintings. It's also a good time to go back and fix any mistakes that you made and paint over them, softening up the eyebrows, for example, getting those eyes a little bit more even. And if you're not sure if it's symmetrical, it's a good idea to look at it turned upside down. You can also take a photo of it and look at the photo. Walking out of the room and coming back is also a good way to do that. It's a good idea just so that you know whether it's symmetrical. So these are Jane's original acrylic paints, and I believe they came in this set. I'm not sure because I have all of them, so I sometimes get a little bit confused, but I think that's the original set, and I love this blue. If you water it down, because it is so pigmented, kind of creates like some almost watercolor looking washes, and if you use it solidly, it's very opaque. So I just wanted to say, if Jane's listening, to make this paint by the gallon. We love this color. I'm just using some little leftover trays, and I'm going to be also using this solid color in the places that I would be otherwise using black. I'm going to want to repeat the same colors throughout the painting in several places because it brings continuity to it. So it's a good idea to use that in the dark places on the flower that would represent the dark in the peacock feather, as well as places like her hair, the pupils of her eyes, the really dark shadow places. So just keeping in mind areas you can use the same colors throughout the painting to create some continuity. It's usually a good idea to limit your palette to a few colors and mix colors from those rather than using them straight out of the tube. It's another way to create a more natural look and some more continuity and make your painting look better. This is very dark. I'm going to have this dark somewhere else in the painting repeating itself, or it is going to seem really imbalanced. So I might choose to make her hair, if her hair was black, it would at least be the same value, and value means how light or dark a color is, and that would help sort of bring some balance to the painting. But it is also a good idea to use the same color repeated multiple times. So here again you can see how if I paint it really solidly, it looks nearly black. So I'm going to be using that for her pupils at this point, and I am going to end up adding some black in later just little touches to give it just a little bit more depth. It's always a good idea to have as much variety in your value as possible, and value just means how light or dark a color is, and it's really good to have the darkest dark you can achieve and white, and quite a few values in between as well. So here you can see I'm just going over the top line of her lash line. I'll end up fixing it quite a bit because you end up painting over it on accident multiple times, and that's fine. This is going to be the darkest point under her chin later, so I know that now. And there's a real solid shadow under the top of her blouse at the neckline there, and her eyebrows, of course, are very dark. It just kind of helps me define the painting to get those lines in there. And here I'm just using a basic stencil and a makeup sponge that you can get at a discount store in the sort of like makeup section, and I just use a very thin layer of any acrylic paint, and you don't want to use a lot because then it'll bleed under the stencil. But when I figured out that you could use a makeup sponge to basically get a printmaking technique for a really low dollar amount, I was pretty excited when I figured that out. I've since seen a couple of other people do it, and it's pretty cool. I'm going to be going over this with some other paint later, but it just gives it some texture. And here I'm just making some marks with the hot pink color in that set, just to add a little bit more interest. Maybe it'll get covered up, we don't know. I also want to bring the girl and the flowers forward from the background and separate them a little bit. So I'm going to make the background around the girl and the flowers that same hot pink color, just to separate them from the background a little bit. And as you'll be able to see, I make it more solid or more opaque, closer to the girl, to really help bring her forward. And then I sort of disperse the paint out a little thinner toward the other side, toward the edges of the canvas, just because I want to have some blue in the background. I think it looks interesting, but just to help give it a little bit of definition. So you can see how I start sort of fading it out a little bit more. I also want to still see some of the stencil marks. It just adds a little bit more interest to the layers, having it show, but not necessarily everywhere. This is a skin tone from one of her original acrylic sets, one of the lighter skin tones, and this is the peachy color in that skin tone. So I will be using both of those and pink in order to create her different skin tones. A small flat brush, and you can see here I am mixing the skin tone with that pinky tone to create the color in her cheeks. And the reason I'm doing that first is because later I want to layer the skin tone over it so that it ends up looking like this color is embedded in her skin and it's part of her skin rather than just like makeup over the top. It's a good way to give it a more natural feeling. It's also a good idea to mix whatever colors you're going to have in the skin. Like if you were using an interesting color for shadows or pinks, to mix it with the skin. You could see right there I put too much paint over her nose and lost the shape, so I just scraped it back with the backside of the paintbrush so that you could still see that. Drawing her eyelids in with the paint over pen. And now I'm going over her face, over the cheeks with the skin color in a real thin layer so you can see that pink underneath, and it helps just make it look like it's embedded color in her face rather than the makeup on top. So now I'm just going to cut away because I'm going to be painting her whole skin in, and it takes a long time. Some basic white paint. I'll be using that to fill in her eye color with a very small pointy brush. I don't want to fill in the whole space because eyes are eyeballs, not almond shapes inside your skin. I don't know how to explain that. Like I accidentally did on that side, but I'm going to go back in to the tear duct area as well as the outside corner and add some skin in so that it looks like her eyes have a round shape rather than this almond alien looking shape. I'm using the same turquoise for the first layer in her eyes, and I usually like to use multiple colors in the eyes because if you look at someone's eyes, there's lots of different colors and speckles and lines going on. Just makes it more interesting. And I'm adding the blue in to the areas that are going to be the shadows later, and I know that that is going to be just a layer underneath. So you can see here how I added the pink into the corners and starting to add a little bit of definition and touching up spots that were missing paint. I have mixed that blue color, the same turquoise, with the skin tone to create some shadows. Don't be afraid to use colors that aren't deemed skin tones because you actually have a lot of colors in your skin that aren't necessarily quote-unquote skin colors, and also the light that reflects off of what's around you is colors on your skin. So it's really cool to paint the shadows in lavenders and blues and things like that that you wouldn't often think would be correct. And also, because it's the same color that is in the background and in her eyes, it's helping to add continuity to the painting. So you can see there where I'm going back and forth with the blue and more of the skin tone to help blend the paint so that it doesn't look like a line. And I added a little bit too much there, so I washed off the brush and cleaned back the paint off of her cheeks just a little bit. As long as you get in there before it dries, you can do a lot of erasing even with acrylic. So here I'm starting to define her eyelids, and that's one of the darkest areas as far as shadow goes, so I'll be adding more shadow later, but that's just the beginning. And a little bit of highlight to the higher point of the brow bone there. A little more shadow underneath her nose and in that little dip above her lip. And then, as you can see, it's more of a shadow on one side of her face, so that implies that the light is coming from one direction rather than straight on. And I tend to always make my shadows in the same pattern. I don't know why. I should probably play with moving the light source around a little bit, but it's important to know that if the light source is coming from one direction, that you need to pay attention to where those shadows are. can see here, I'm needing to blend out that cheek a little bit. It was a little bit more like a solid shape, so I went back and forth between the skin tone and the pink just to blend that out a little bit more. And now I'm just redefining with that really dark blue. I added a little bit of a streak of hair falling over her ear, and it's mixed a little bit with white so that it looks like that hair is being hit with some light and a little bit of highlight. And I'm adding the same dark blue back over the light blue just to add a little depth to her eyes, and making it a little darker around the edge because it's a little bit normally darker at the edges and lighter toward the center, and I'm scraping back with the back of the brush there to create some lines going toward the center so you can see that light blue underneath. I could have also painted it back in, but that's one technique. And I redefined the shadow a little bit darker next to her nose and on that side of the face. Generally it takes a few layers to get this looking more interesting and together. So here I'm strengthening that shadow between the lips so that it looks more like two shapes, and back under her nostrils it needs to be a lot darker there. So I just mixed the pink color with that dark blue to create a very dark shadow on her upper lip. Generally in drawings or paintings it's nice to have the upper lip look darker than the bottom one because it insinuates a shadow. And going in and finishing up the ear. So now I'm just going around the painting and redefining some of the messy spots that got accidentally painted over, darkening up places that need a little bit more opaque paint, and generally it's a little bit of back and forth at this point. So it's important to have patience. Line I felt was a little bit too strong, so I wet the brush and sort of cleaned it back a little bit so it doesn't look like such a strong line and more like a shadow. And here I added her little eyelashes. Later I ended up deciding that she needed a little more shadow over her eyes, so I end up going over them again. And like I said, there's generally a little bit of back and forth. Don't get frustrated, it's a process. Also added a very subtle shadow across the top of her actual eyeball because, well, it's a shape, so the eyelashes and the top of the eyelid would cast a shadow. So now I'm starting to go with a thin layer of pink lip skin color over that darker shadow, and you can still see it through it, and adding some little highlights of brighter pink to the parts that look like they're coming forward. And if you notice that I used the same pink color in her lips that I did in her tear ducts, and that helps tie the painting together as well. Adding a little bit more shadow under the edges of her bottom lip, and a little more shadow in between just to give it more shape. So I mixed the dark blue with some white to add some highlights to her hair, because hair has shape as well, so you want to get highlights and lowlights in it to give it some definition also. So I'm adding brighter streaks of white toward that part toward the top where the light would be hitting it. Now I'm going back with the same hot pink to further bring her out of the background a little bit forward and separate her from that background a little bit. And the same peachy color that I used in her skin, I'm going to be adding to her shirt to help tie the painting together again. It's kind of like they say if you have green eyes, it's a good idea to wear green because it draws attention to your eyes. It's the same kind of visual trick. And I'm not painting it completely solidly because I want to see the blue underneath, because I think that layery texture is just more interesting. So here I'm going back with a mixture of the turquoise and the skin tone to add some more shadows under the line of her hair and under the edge of her blouse, just to give it a little bit more depth as well. Now I'm using black to go over her eyebrows and strengthen up the really darkest points in the painting, like her pupils and right under the very deepest shadow points. here I'm using the turquoise mixed with white just to make the flowers a little bit more opaque because it helps bring them forward in the painting and draw a little more attention to them, since the background looks much more messy and layery. Having the foreground look different from the background helps pull the two apart. And the flowers are now not the same exact color, but they're similar. It also gives me the opportunity to add a little bit of highlights later along the top edges, just to make the flowers look a little more like a three-dimensional shape as well. I think also bringing some white into the painting, because it mimics the white in her eyes, and later some highlight points that I'm going to have in her face, also helps tie the painting together and draw your attention to those points. So here I'm just adding a little reflections in her eyes. And it always seems like the moment you do that, your character comes to life. I'm also adding a little bit of thin white to the areas that come forward the most, like the center of her nose, the center of her forehead, little highlights on her lips. Any point that you think comes forward and the light would hit really adds a little bit of three-dimensional quality to it. Little dots in her tear ducts. So now I'm just going to add a little bit more black to a couple spots to strengthen it up, redefining her lash line and giving her some eyelashes, strengthening up her pupils and the shapes in the painting and the darkest points with that black. So as you can see, this character is really kind of playful. I'm not taking it very seriously. And if you practice, anybody can paint this. I've had my students that are little kids do some pretty great paintings just following along these basic techniques. So don't be afraid to give it a try. And it doesn't need to be perfect. It's a process. It's really just supposed to be about having fun.